These things in the precious name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you, Bryan.
Just check my volume. You might need this. There we go. I am so happy to be here. One of my favorite things to talk about is families. And so I'll be introducing myself so you know who I am, and then we're going to get right into the story of Abraham. So this picture right here, see this tree right here? This is the Mesopotamian depiction of the tree of life. And Abraham, when he was in Ur, he would have immediately recognized this as the tree of life. So I tried to capture some of that when we're thinking about untangling our relationships, because we're going to be talking about Abraham's family. Even though we are separated by over 4,000 years, we can still see the family dynamics that happened in that family. So I am 42 years old. I'm fairly able. I can carry things up and down stairs. I wear glasses when I'm looking at a screen or reading for too long. I identify as a white Irish American, heterosexual. I prefer the pronouns he, him, his. I've been married since 2009, and I just met someone for lunch that was married the same exact day that I was. That was pretty surprising. So married for that long, functional specialty, so I do research. I'm also a marriage and family therapist. So I practice on Mondays, and I teach at Loma Linda University full-time in the marriage and family therapy program. So I teach master's and doctoral students, and I do some research as well. Never worked for the military, though I've done research for the Air Force for several years. Job level associate faculty member, was born here in the United States, third generation Seventh-day Adventist, non-union at Loma Linda University. I'm an abstract sequential thinker. If you like the Enneagram, I'm an Enneagram 7. If you like Myers-Briggs, I'm an ENFP. So that's kind of how I think, how I move out the world in my mind. I live in Southern California. I'm a parent of 2 children, both via IVF, in vitro fertilization. They're both rainbow babies. One of them is 1.5 years old, and the other one is 5 years old. Education, I have a PhD in marriage and family therapy. I'm a non-smoker. I've done many different things. I was a pastor for 3 years where I met Pastor Vince. And then communication style, I can be professional, but I was also part of an improv team for over 10 years, so I can be a little bit silly once in a while. So some of that might come out. We will see. Okay, so here's Penelope, and here's Phoenix, and here they are, the pumpkin patch. And here my eldest is boxing out my youngest one. This is at Thanksgiving. They're buttering the rolls. They both like cooking with me. I try and cook as much as possible with them because I think it's a fun sensory activity. And then here we are, we're having snack together. So here's the plan. We're going to talk tonight for about 2 hours, and we're going to be going through the story of Abraham. I'm guessing most people are familiar with the story, but I'm hoping we can highlight some new dynamics that are occurring in that family. Because even though the story of Genesis is clearly about God, Elohim, creator God, Adonai, Yahweh, the person who creates this covenant with humanity, there's an awful lot of family drama in the book of Genesis. A lot of specifics about the Abrahamic story and what's happening in his family. And so we'll be asking some questions about that family to try and get to know that family better. Then tomorrow morning at 9:30, and then Sabbath sermon at 11, and then Sabbath afternoon at 2 p.m. we'll be finishing up. Family dysfunction rolls down from generation to generation like a fire in the woods, taking down everything in its path until one person in one generation has the courage to turn and face the flames. That person brings peace to their ancestors and spares the children that follow. Everything we do in life, all of our behaviors, are part of a pattern, or patterns, plural. Everything we do is part of a pattern. And a lot of what we learned, we practiced and had modeled for us in our family of origin. So those patterns have been passed down from generation to generation to generation, and we're going to be tracking the family patterns in the story of Abraham. And there are some clear patterns that occur in several different generations, and we're going to use a tool called a genogram to follow those family patterns. A genogram is like a family tree, but we're not just interested in biological relationships. We're interested in how people are interacting within that family. So one of the first things I'm going to do is teach you how to read a genogram. Every behavior that occurs in a family is a symptom of the system. Every behavior is a symptom of the family system. So if there's someone's behavior that we don't like, that's just a symptom of what's happening in the rest of the family. If there's a child that's acting out at school, That's usually a symptom of the system of their family or the classroom experience. So I want you to think of behaviors not as individual choices, but every behavior is a symptom of what's happening within the family system. So we're going to be looking at Abraham's family. So this is what a typical family tree looks like. We have some people up here, and they beget this person, and these two person beget this person, these two partner up, and they have this child, this person partners with this person. That's what a family tree is. And we're going to be looking at a genogram. Here's the beginning of a genogram. I'm going to walk you through this till we're all on the same page. And I might need Vince up here with a microphone if people have questions. Okay. Here's how you read a genogram. This person down here that has this box around them, this is who is creating the genogram. This is Dahlia. Dahlia has created this genogram. Circles are females, squares are males. So when up here we have Thornton, who has partnered in a romantic relationship with Becca. They're married. Thornton has passed away. There's an X through Thornton. Thornton is the father, Becca is the mother, and they've had 3 children. The way that it works, you take the eldest individual first, the eldest child, then the next eldest child, then the next eldest child. So Tyson is the firstborn, he's the firstborn son. There's a middle-born son, James, and a youngest-born daughter, Christy. How are we feeling so far? Good? Okay, great. James partnered up with Roxy, and Roxy and James had 2 children. Here's Jeff, and here's Trisha. There's the triangle in the middle of Trisha. So this is identifying Trisha. Trisha identifies as lesbian, and she has a partner over here, and they have a daughter over here. Here's Jeff, who partnered up with Sophia, and here's Sophia, Emily, and Damien. Emily is transgender. I just want to show what the different symbols look like. Roberto and Martin here, see, they both come in the same place right here. This means they are twins. So Roberto's still alive, but Martin has passed away at the time when this genogram was created. So we have this question mark here. We do not know who the biological father is over here. These double hash marks indicate that there was a divorce between this person, or at least a legal separation between this individual and Gladys, and they only had 1 daughter, Roxy, and then Roxy partnered up with James. How are we feeling so far about the symbols we see? Yes, hand over here.
Is that an X? Does that mean James passed away as well?
James has passed away as well, yes. Every time there's an X, it means that individual has passed away at the time when this genogram was created. So Thornton has passed away, James has passed away, Gladys passed away, Ricky passed away, Martin passed away, Karina's passed away. So several people have passed away, but some people are still alive. How are we feeling about this so far? Raise your hand if you have any questions. All right, I'm going to take no hands as an indicator I should keep going. Here's where it gets exciting. Okay. We're going to be talking about what's happening within the family, because we're not just interested in who is biologically related to or who has a romantic relationship with someone else. We're interested in how they are interacting with one another. So here on the bottom left, we have a legend. So anytime you want to, you can refer to the legend. So 2 green lines means a close relationship. See that? 3 red lines means a fused relationship. This means they're close, but they're too close. They're sharing everything. They're enmeshed, might be another word you might have heard before. They're too close with one another. They're in each other's business in a maladaptive way, in a way that's not healthy for either of them. When there's this red jagged line, squiggly line, that means there's conflict between individuals. If there's a blue line with an arrow, that's some sort of abuse that's occurring. If there's a dotted line, that means emotional distance. And if there's a red dotted line with these little hash marks in the middle, that means emotional cutoff. Emotional cutoff is when I might be near you physically, but I'm not going to pay attention to you because I don't want to be around you. Or I might move away physically because I can't handle the tension, so you're dead to me, that sort of thing. There's a hand over here.
So all of this is according to how Dahlia sees
Thank you.
relationship.
Yes, all of this is according to how Dahlia sees this happening. So genograms are subjective, meaning they're from one individual's perspective. And this is Dahlia's perspective of what's happening. If someone else in this genogram created this genogram, it might look slightly different from Dahlia's perspective of what's happening in the family. So let's walk through this. So there's this emotional cutoff between Thornton and Becca. There's also a emotional cutoff between Becca and Tyson and Becca and James. But Becca and Christy are fused. They're enmeshed. They're too closely involved in each other's lives in a way that's unhealthy. We see James as distant from his eldest son, Jeff. We see Jeff as distant from Sophia. We see Gladys was perpetrating some sort of abuse against her daughter, Roxy. And Roxy is the nucleus of a lot of tension in the family, right? We can see the arrow going this direction, so there's some abuse from Roxy to Christy, abuse from Roxy to Jeff, abuse from Roxy to Trisha, and then Roxy has conflict with almost everyone else in the family. We see there's some closeness here. We see there's some closeness between Roberto and Martin, and Roberto and his middle child. We see there's closeness between Roberto and his son-in-law, Jeff, and there's some closeness between Jeff and his youngest son, Philip, some closeness between Sophia and Dahlia. So how are we feeling about some of these symbols we see up there? Ask me a question before I move on. Feeling good, but wow, yes.
I've noticed Thornton has passed away.
Yep.
But so that cutoff happened before his decease.
Correct. That happened before he passed away. One thing we're going to get to later, just because someone passes away in the family does not mean that the unresolved tension that individual had with other people in the family suddenly disappears. That anxiety just gets redistributed amongst the rest of the remaining family members. Hand over here.
Are we going to eventually get some kind of a chart and paperwork so we kind of learn how to read?
Am I going to give you a chart and paperwork this weekend? No, but we're going to be practicing this as we go along. So hopefully we get a little bit more practice. Ask me another question about what's going on. Is there going to be a test? There's going to be a big test at the end. No test. Another hand over here.
When you're doing, is Dahlia let's say these were people you were seeing. Would Dahlia probably be the only person in that family you would be seeing, or might she bring other people in?
Oh, no, you actually have family therapy practice question. I'm happy to see many people in the room. I'm happy to see 4, 5, 6. I've had 7 people in the room. I love it. More the merrier. Yes? Is that good question? This is the youngest generation. Correct. What's happening in the family? She's looking back 1, 2, 3 generations. She is the 4th generation right here. Yeah, good question. Someone create a hypothetical scenario about who might be the problem person in this family. Roxy. Why is Roxy the problem person? I see your hand. I'll get to you, Elizabeth. Why do you think Roxy is the problem person? All roads lead to there, right. What do you think some of the family's narratives or stories are about Roxy? Negative. Yeah.
Is she chosen a different lifestyle?
Good. I'm loving this question. I'm loving the responses because it's very easy to see this one person as the problem, right? But every behavior is a symptom of the system. Maybe Roxy is just the person who happens to be the symptom bearer for this family, and a lot of anxiety is funneled towards her. Maybe she never had an opportunity to experience a safe relationship. Look at the relationship between her and her mother. So because of that, maybe she never understood what it was like to be in a healthy relationship. Because of that, I'm getting some tingles, even though this is a hypothetical situation. The only way she knows to move about the world is with conflict and abuse. Because that's what she learned in her family of origin. So, is she the problem? Every behavior is a symptom of the system. So she is doing what she learned in her family. But it's real easy to point our fingers at Roxy, right? She's a source of a lot of difficulty. Yes, question over here.
Yeah, you mentioned that the relationship lines are subjective. Right?
Yep, subjective. Correct.
But the breakups and the divorce, that would probably more be factual?
Good, so that's factual, right? Yes, so that's factual. But these colored lines, how people are interacting, that's definitely more subjective. Absolutely. Good. What's a possible reason why Jeff has a close relationship with his father-in-law? Why do you think Jeff might possibly have a closer relationship with his father-in-law? We're just going to make up a story. Okay, maybe no family history problems. Okay, but there is some emotional distance between him and his biological father. So there's some distance here. There's also some distance between him and his wife, right, over here, between Jeff and Sophia. So maybe, I don't know, maybe Jeff didn't really have a close connection with his biological father, but he found a close connection with his father-in-law. Looks like his father-in-law had a close connection with his twin brother over here, and one of his siblings over here. So maybe there's something about Jeff's characteristics that Roberto's like, oh, I like this individual, and Jeff felt safe with this person. And notice how there's these crossing lines of close connections happening across different families. We're going to see some of these close connections or favoritism shown in the story of Abraham. But I wanted to make sure we can get a little more traction with this. Notice how Dahlia has some conflict with Philip, her biological brother. You see that? Where do you think, what side of the family do you think she learned to have this sort of conflict from? Her mother's side or her father's side? Maybe both. Over here, it seems like the family tend to emotionally distance themselves and cut off from other people. When there was conflict, this side of the family decided to create emotional distance to deal with that tension. This side of the family seemed to sit in that tension and hold that tension, hold that conflict. So maybe Dahlia, right now, currently, she learned this sort of behavior from this side of the family. Later on, she might learn some of this emotional distance, or we might see her having some emotional distance with other family members or friends or bosses or neighbors. But everything she learned from her family of origin. And her family of origin pulled from two different playbooks. And each of those parent-grandparent playbooks pulled from great-grandparent playbooks. So everything that we're doing, every behavior is a symptom of the system. All right. Move on.
So you're going to show us how to untangle that whole mess right there, aren't you?
Yes, well, the first thing is to understand that this is happening. That's the first step. If we can understand that every behavior is a symptom of the system, and our behaviors are patterned, and we learn those patterns, we can start to recognize when those same symptoms, those same behaviors, continue to show up on our relationships. And if we don't recognize, oh, this is part of a pattern, then it's going to be really hard to change that. So insight is the first step. And a genogram is a great way to identify that there are some patterns in our families. Yes?
We learn all kinds of behavior, and we imprint.
We learn this some behavior.
That becomes normality.
And this becomes the norm. Yes. So we learn behaviors. This becomes the norm for the family. This is how we do things. And sometimes it becomes a matter of right and wrong. You're doing it right or you're doing it wrong. When it may not be about right and wrong, maybe it's just different and I don't like it. But it feels like right and wrong. And if it's an issue of right and wrong, we feel like we have to stand up and defend ourselves because we have a moral obligation to do that. When in reality, it may not be about right and wrong. Some of it might just be different and I don't like it. It's uncomfortable. Okay. It will take every triggered nerve, every tremble in your voice, every butterfly in your belly, and every rejoicing ancestor for you to say, no, I'm not doing this anymore. If you want to make changes in your family, and if you have offspring you want to make changes for, you don't make changes in the next generation. You make changes in your own life, no matter where you are at in your lifespan. You make changes in your own life, and in doing so, you create space for future generations to also open up their own playbook and not just operate from whatever you've handed down from your family of origin. Is there another question over here?
Observation.
Okay.
I faced this when my kids were little. My father was beat you up when you made a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
It happened once with my middle daughter because my oldest daughter lied.
Mm-hmm.
I felt so guilt-ridden after that event that I vowed I would not become my father.
Making clear decisions not to participate in the same sort of behaviors that we witnessed or experienced in our previous family of origin, you have to be real intentional about that, right? It doesn't happen on accident. Yeah. And sometimes it takes bone-crushing determination not to do those things.
For 25 years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we're going to be talking about stress and anxiety today. I'm going to actually use the terms interchangeably because that stress and anxiety manifest themselves very similar in our bodies physiologically. The big difference between stress and anxiety is that stress, we know the source of the stress. I'm stressed about trying to do my taxes. And when I'm done with the taxes, I'm so glad that's done. So I know what the source of my stress is. When it's anxiety, I don't always know the source of the anxiety. I'm just sensing anxious. I'm just being anxious, and I don't know necessarily why. Whereas stress, I know exactly what the reason is. So I'll be using those two terms interchangeably, even though there is a important difference between them, but physiologically, they manifest themselves in a very similar manner. Overwhelmedness, we can be upset. It doesn't just mean nervous, it could be angry or weepy or sad. However, anxiety or unresolved tension manifests itself in our lives, we often also learned from our family of origin. What was appropriate, what was not appropriate, how we show when we're upset or not upset. All of that is pattern behavior that we learned through other people. Okay. So we pass on stress and anxiety in our relationships from person to person to person like a hot potato. And so what happens is stress and anxiety are passed down from generation to generation like a precious family heirloom. So unresolved stuff that happened in previous generations just gets shoveled down to the next generation, then shoveled down to the next generation. So a lot of the stuff we're dealing with right now is old. It's been passed down from generation to generation, and we're going to be able to see that when we're tracking the Abrahamic narrative. So what are we doing this evening? We're looking at the family to try and find out what are some of the rules in Abraham's family. How do they operate? What's important? How do they navigate their lives? What are some of the intergenerational patterns of behavior? This just means monkey see, monkey do. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. What are some of these patterns that we clearly see happen in one generation and then are repeated in the following generation, and then again in the following generation? How do people in the family handle anxiety and tension when there's conflict? How does the family decide to try and resolve this conflict? Who are the villains and who are the heroes? Who has power? Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? And then if anyone remembers, and remember what chapter in the Bible Abram's story begins in? It's okay. Most people think of this story as happening in chapter 12, the call of God. God calls Abram and Sarai out to Canaan, right, to the wild west of Canaan. But the story actually begins in the previous chapter. So when you look at our chapter breaks in our English Bible, those are artificial. They were put in later. The original Hebrew text did not have those chapter breaks. Those were put in later to help organize the text. The story of Abraham doesn't begin with God's call to Abraham. There's some important information before that the narrator of the story actually wants us to know about the family. And when you talk about Hebrew stories, the first few sentences are really key for setting up the baseline for understanding who and what this family is about. Also, I want you to be thinking about in your head, I will be giving you a little quiz in a few minutes. Who is Abram and Sarai's first son? So I want you to think about who is their first son. I'll be asking you that in a few minutes. So, Abram and Sarai. Later on, their names changed to Abraham and Sarah, right? I'm going to try and remain true to that. Once I got called out saying, well, their names were different before, so I made all these changes so the saints would be upset. The very first thing we know about the family is Sarai was barren, and she had no child. That's how this family starts. Before we know that she is beautiful, we know that she is barren. Before we learn that she is actually Abram's half-sister, we learn that she can't have children. That's how the family starts. There's a man and woman, and they can't have children. And that's how the family starts. And if we know this makes the call of God to Abraham and Sarai to come to the wild west of Canaan much more powerful. Now, we're going to be talking about infertility tonight, because infertility is something that was experienced in Abraham's family. In fact, in all 4 generations of Abraham, they experience infertility. In my own life, my wife and I experienced some infertility and some losses. And the last full week of April, so like 5 or 6 weeks from now, is National Infertility Awareness Week. This is something that a lot of people experience, but we don't necessarily talk about very often. And throughout the year, there are other specific days about this, and the holidays are usually difficult for individuals who experience infertility. Infertility is a disease or condition of the reproductive system, often diagnosed after a couple has had 1 year of unprotected, well-timed intercourse, or if the woman has suffered from multiple miscarriages, and the woman is under 35 years old. If the woman is over 35 years old, it is diagnosed after only 6 months of unprotected, well-timed intercourse. In our story, Abram and Sarah are 75 and 65, a little bit over that 35 age range. I mean, obviously back then, they might have a different sort of lifespan, different sort of health, but even if we double the 35, we're right up that age range, right? And we know clearly it's set out that Sarai experienced some infertility. And it's very clear in the biblical narrative that Sarai is the problem, right? But we know now that infertility isn't just attributed to a woman's challenge. It can also be the male's challenges, right? And sometimes it's a question mark about where the challenge is. But in the biblical narrative, it's always the woman's fault. And currently, 1 out of 8 couples have trouble getting pregnant or sustaining pregnancy, and 1 in 4 women will experience a miscarriage in their lifetime. This is something that happens a lot. We just don't talk about it very often. So here's the call of Abraham. This is where most people think of the story of Abraham beginning. And I want you to listen to the themes when God is calling Abraham. 2 big themes come out: family and land. Those 2 things. Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. So you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So you should be able to see family and earth over and over and over again. This is important because we are hearkening back to something that happened previously in the book of Genesis. Remember the story after the fall, Adam and Eve, and God comes in the garden and he talks with Adam and Eve? This is what he says to Adam: "Cursed is the ground, the land, because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you. And you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, and for you are dust, and to dust you shall return." A lot of land imagery here. Now, if you work the fields and you're trying to grow food, yes, you can get blisters and sweat and dust and dirty, and your back might hurt, and your shoulders might be sore, and your feet might be sore as well. But the real pain of working to try and grow food isn't the blisters and the body aches. The real pain of trying to grow food is when you're trying to grow food and no fruit is produced. That's the real pain, right? Let's look previous verse, Genesis 3:16. So God said to the woman, he said, "I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you will bring forth children. Yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." So I personally have never given birth. So there are some things that I do not know, and I know I will never fully understand. However, after having multiple conversations with my wife and other people, yes, there is physical pain in childbirth, and childbirth is a very scary time. It's a very risky time in a woman's life, right? But one of the real pains of childbirth is when you're trying to have children and you can't produce children. God is saying the pain you're going to experience when you're trying to produce food from the land and trying to produce children, and those don't come to fruition, this is the pain that I'm talking about. So the big question is, in the Abrahamic narrative, how is the family going to respond to famine, and how is the family going to respond to infertility? Because God said it was going to happen in chapter 3. And then we get to chapter 11, and finally we see what's happening. This family that is experiencing both famine and infertility. How are they going to respond to this? So here's our genealogy so far, according to the Bible. So Abram marries his half-sister Sarai, which is appropriate for them back then. Then he has his middle son Nahor. His youngest brother Haran also has some offspring, and Milcah ends up being partnered with Abraham's middle brother. And Lot, remember Lot's name? The nephew, right? Here we go. I'm going to bring them up here so we can kind of see the partnership here. Now we have the romantic partners. Haran has passed away. See the X through Haran. But we have Lot, who ends up going with Abraham and Sarai. Remember that? Okay. So here in is where Abram and Sarai were. They went up here to Padamaran. We're going to come back here in about half an hour. Padamaran, they were up here. And then they go to the wild, wild west of Canaan. Now, who likes checking their emails? Raise your hand if you like doing emails. Maybe you didn't hear me. Raise your hand if you like checking your emails. Okay, nobody is enjoying checking the emails. Okay, if you don't like emails, you can blame the Mesopotamians, right? Because they were the first individuals who created the cuneiform. They were the ones who started to start this whole writing process, so you can blame it on them. If you've heard the phrase, "I don't want to recreate the wheel," they're ones who created the wheel. This was a cosmopolitan city. Because they're near Tigris and Euphrates, they were actually able to grow wheat and barley up to 5 or 10 times more than the other areas because they were using irrigation. So because of that, they produced a lot of goods and exported that goods. So this was a very wealthy and cosmopolitan city. A lot of people would be coming in here for trade. And in fact, the big city of had running water and wells inside the city, as well as some running water in some of the homes. So this is a very up-to-do sort of place. Very different from the wild, wild west of the Bedouin lifestyle in Canaan. Very different worlds. And this is where God, so they're up here and God calls them here even farther away from this location that they know very well. So their story was actually their infertility journey. I want you to see this story as this family that has difficulty getting food and difficulty having children. And this is what we're looking at as we go through the rest of Genesis. So help me out. Who is Abram and Sarai's first son? Ishmael. Okay, I have one vote for Ishmael. Okay. Any other votes? Isaac. Okay, what? I hear Isaac and Ishmael. Any other options? Lot. Why would you say Lot? Through adoption. Absolutely. Lot was their first child. They did not have the foster care system back then, right? They did not have orphanages. When parents pass away, other family members adopt that child. And we can actually see in the story that Lot was a very favored son, adopted son of that family. Let's take a look. Even, side note, today sometimes there's this view that adopted children aren't the same as biological children. But there's something called, have you heard of a gotcha day? A gotcha day is the day that the child was adopted by that family. Adopted children can be loved, can become part of the family. They are not less than, but sometimes we have this idea that they're not as important. That's absolutely not true. And we'll see in this narrative how important Lot was to this family. So the narrator wants us to make sure we are tracking that Lot is now a part of this family. He is their first son. So Abram went forth as the Lord has spoken to him, and Lot went with him. The narrator is making very clear, and the Lot went with these two people. Now, Abram was 75 years old, and he's departed from Haran. Abram took Sarah his wife and Lot his nephew. Don't miss this, folks. Lot is part of this family now. They are linked together. All their positions set up for the land of Canaan. Next chapter, Abraham lies to Pharaoh about his wife. This is my sister, not my wife. And then later on, we find out what's happened. So Abram went up from Egypt, Negev, and he went down with Lot, went with him. Now Lot, who went with Abraham, also had flocks and herds and tents. So Lot is a part of what's happening in this family. So Lot is adopted by Abram and Sarai. In Genesis 13, 14, and 18, we see that Abram really cares for Lot. Abram lets Lot choose first where he wants to settle. There's some conflict between the shepherds, and Lot says, look, we're fighting amongst ourselves. You choose first. Where do you want to go? And Lot chooses the lush area of Sodom and Gomorrah. But he lets Lot choose first. In 14, there are 4 kings from the east, Mesopotamia, that come into the land to try and get money and tribute, and Sodom and Gomorrah refuse to pay. So these 4 kings and their army take up Lot and everyone else that was in Sodom and Gomorrah and take them off. And Abram, even though he's vastly outnumbered, get his friends together, chases after them to rescue Lot and other people. Abraham bargains for God to save Lot's life in chapter 18. A very risky business, standing up to the divine, saying, well, what if there's 50? All the way down to just a little, because he's trying to save Lot. Abram said, Lord God, but Abraham is still, even though he's adopted Lot, he still wants a child. So as he's cutting a covenant with God, he's still asking, what about this child that you promised? You called us all the way out here to the wild west of Canaan. Where is this child that you've promised us? He's still waiting for that. So there's this sweet idea that Sarai has to have Hagar join into the party, right? To join in what's happening. And what is the reason that Sarah comes up with this idea to have Hagar join in to help out? Because she's barren, right? Because she's barren. And because she's barren, and because she's brought Hagar here, who, by the way, they picked up in Egypt, we have a lot of negative narratives about Sarai, right? If she would just been more faithful, then maybe God would have brought forth a child without all of this family drama. Now, Sarai there was no mention of Sarah ever having an individual that joined her on her journey to help her with infertility. If we look at the later generations, all the women come with a nurse or someone else, a concubine, to help them with the infertility process. Sarah does not have that. And now they pick up someone from Egypt. So here's her idea. I want you to entertain an idea. This is really just a surrogate, which is like, Hagar is acting as a surrogate, which is like the IVF of the day. So Sarai proposing this idea to Abraham wasn't like, Abram, I got this totally new idea that no one's ever thought of before. How about we take this maidservant and you can produce a child with this person. This will be our child. This is not the first time that's ever happened. We don't hear Abram going, whoa, that's a really creative idea, Sarah. I've never thought of that. This is just the normal way people in this culture would approach this challenge of infertility. It's not just Abraham's family that's experiencing this. Other people are also experiencing this challenge. And we'll see it later on in the narrative. So Hagar ends up running away, right? So she runs away down to Egypt. And it's clear in the biblical narrative there is this critique against polygamy. But so we know that Ishmael is the biological son of which two individuals? Abram and Hagar is the biological child of Ishmael. Ishmael is the biological child of Abram and Hagar. How about Isaac? Where did Isaac come from? Abraham and Sarah. Good. Okay. Now, if we go 2 generations down the road, the 12 sons of Israel, can anyone tell me which sons came from Leah or Rachel or Bilhah or Zilpah? We can do Rachel. Okay, let's do with what we know. Let's start with what we know. Who are the biological sons of Rachel? Joseph and Benjamin. Good. Okay. How about the others? Concubines, Cloudy. What did you say?
I said Rachel, Leah's concubines.
Okay, so we make a really big deal about who the biological son is of Hagar and Abram. Oh, that's Ishmael. And the biological son of Sarah and Abram. Oh, that's Isaac. We make a big distinction between them, right? How come we don't make the same sort of distinction 2 generations later about which sons came from the concubines, which ones did not?
Because they downplayed it through the generations.
That became normal.
It became normal, or it was already normal. It's just that there were just 2 sons here. So it's really easy to say this one versus this one. Whereas maybe it wasn't as big of a deal for us as readers, it's not. In the story, it's clear. The children know who their biological mothers are. We make a really big deal about this, but on the other hand, 2 generations later, we don't make that big of a deal. If you're interested, here's the list of sons linked with their biological mothers. If you're like, well, I want to be consistent, Bryan. I want to make sure I know which sons came from the concubines and which ones did not. You can look at this, or you can look it up online. Okay, so Hagar is running away back down to Egypt. God meets Hagar, says, I see you, Beersheba, and sends her back. Then we know that Hagar gives birth, and Sarah is not mentioned being present at the birth. This is clear that Sarah is saying this is a bad idea. Hagar, this is your child, Ishmael. That's not my child. Not my child. And later on, we will have Isaac come onto the scene as well. Genesis 17, there are name changes, finally to Abraham and Sarah. Okay, I don't have to say Abram or Sarai anymore. Say the full names. There's circumcision. There's more infertility, more mentions of saying, God, like, we're still infertile. You promised us this. What's going on here? And then here's Abraham bargaining with God. What about 50, 45, 40, 30, 10? Maybe there's just 10 people. Part of Lot's immediate family, right? Lot, his wife, his kids, maybe if they have partners. Just this group of people would he be willing to save? He's really interested in preserving Lot. We know that Abraham is not a morning person. Why? There are 3 times in the book of Genesis where Abraham gets up in the morning. All the other times he sleeps in. Here are the 3 times that he gets up. We're going to reverse chronological order. Genesis 22, this is the binding of Isaac when Abraham's going to take Isaac up to the mountain. Let's look at what happens. The narrator slows down the story so we can see every single step. So we have Abraham, who is a seasoned individual at this point in time, and he rose early in the morning, and he saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place which God had told him. So the narrator takes 6 different verbs to tell us all the things that Abraham is doing early in the morning. When I picture this, there's an individual who is very wealthy at this point in time, does not need to be doing this, but he is still doing it. I know for me, when I get up early in the morning and I can't sleep, I sometimes get up and just do things because my mind is racing. So I'm seeing the same sort of thing happening here. This is the last time we hear Abraham getting up early in the morning to take his son, Isaac, up to the mountain to sacrifice him. Here's the second time Abraham gets up early, when Ishmael is about to be sent into the desert. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took the bread and the skin of water and gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulder, gave her the boy. This is the last thing he does, gave her the boy and sent her away. Again, this man who's getting up, who could have had a servant do this, but it's clear that he is trying to squeeze all the last few moments that he can of this time he has with his child in camp before this child might be sent off to pass away. That's essentially what's happened, sending him off to the desert to die. The first time Abraham does this, Genesis 19, the angels go to save Lot and his daughters. And in the morning, Abraham arose early in the morning, same thing, and went to the place where he had stood before the Lord, where he had bargained with God. And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and looked toward all the land of the valley, and he saw, and behold, the smoke of the land ascended like the smoke of the furnace. So the first time Abraham gets up early, he's wondering, what's going to happen? Is my son going to be alive? He does that for all of his 3 sons. In Genesis 20, Abraham lies again, this time to King Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. He used the same exact lie he did down in Egypt, because if it works there, worked quote unquote, let's try and use it again up here with this culture. And the punishment, God actually came to Abimelech and said, do you know what's happening here? And Abimelech actually comes out looking like the more righteous person in this interaction. And the punishment was, for the Lord had closed fast all the wombs of the household of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. This idea that other people can catch this infertility, and this is a punishment from God. This is a big thing in this culture, not just in Abraham's family, but ubiquitous around the cultures at this time. Yes?
So this must have been, and then first time I've noticed it, there must have been some time frame here that Sarah was part of that process, that capture.
Yes, 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 yes.
Wow.
Okay. Lot's daughters saying to Lot, I'm pregnant. Lot saying, I'm going to be a grandpa. I'm going to be a grandpa, right? Father. Everyone is interested in trying to overcome infertility, and they're willing to take drastic measures, even looking at Lot's children, because everyone is desperate, even fringe characters in the story of Abraham. This is a big thing in the biblical narrative. So, Genesis 21, Isaac finally arrives, and Ishmael ends up Isaacing. The verb is teasing Isaacing Isaac. And when Sarah sees Ishmael Isaacing Isaac, she gets upset and says, send this servant and the boy away from me. I don't want them near my son. So Hagar and Ishmael are sent away off into the desert. And there's this big rift in this family, right? Big rift. Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac. So after the story, when Abraham comes down the mountain, there's this little interlude in the story. And this interlude is kind of like the narrator saying, okay, we just finished the story of Abraham and taking Isaac to the mountain, and then Abraham comes down the mountain. As a side note, back at the ranch, there's this family back in Padamaran. And there's a very specific individual that I want you to pay attention to, and that individual is the father of Rebekah. I'm going to mention this individual because this is important for what's happening in the story. So Abraham goes up the mountain to sacrifice Isaac, comes down the mountain. There's this interlude telling us about Padamaran and Rebekah. And the very next chapter, so here's Rebekah in the family tree if you want to see where she's at. The very next chapter, Sarah passes away. So it's Abraham sacrificed Isaac, interlude about Rebekah. The very next verse, Sarah passes away. Let's look at it chronologically without the chapter breaks. If you're just looking verse by verse. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived in Beersheba. So where is Abraham? Beersheba. Good. Back at the ranch with Rebekah. Very next verse, now Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. Sarah died in Kiriath-arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came in to mourn for Sarah and weep for her. You can also translate it, Abraham went up to mourn for her. So Abraham was living in where? Beersheba. And where did Sarah pass away? Hebron. Okay. Doesn't sound like the same city, right? In fact, in this chapter 23, Abraham always refers to her as my dead. Only the narrator refers to Sarah as Abraham's wife. So let's look at a map real quick. Here's the distance between Beersheba and Hebron. It's about a marathon, 26 straight miles. Obviously, the roads aren't that straight, right? That's just as the crow flies, 26.4 miles. So what does that mean for us? Here's Beersheba and Hebron. Here's St. Helena down here, and here's Adams. Do you know where Adams is? I don't know. I just according to the map. Cobb, near Cobb. Okay, it's by Cobb. Okay. This is the same distance. So it's saying Abraham was living here. Sarah passed away up here. So a couple things could be the case. One, the narrator doesn't care as much about locations as we do. Just saying, just putting out these locations so that we know that these places exist. We also know that this is a family that is moving around to make sure they get enough food for their herds and their flocks, right? So constantly moving. But the way that this is sandwiched with Abraham lives here, Beck at the ranch over here, and by the way, Sarah passes away over here at a different location, tells me there's some physical distance between them. Does this physical distance represent something else, emotional distance? I don't know. But here's what I know. I know that Sarai came from a cosmopolitan city where there was running water. She's pulled up here. She's promised to have a child. She waits 25 years before she's able to realize that, but she's living in the wild west of Canaan. I know that her husband lied to Pharaoh and to Abimelech about her being his sister, not his wife. And there's no mention in the story of Abraham talking to Sarah about taking Isaac up to the mountain. So takes him up to the mountain, comes back down, back at the ranch, Sarah dies. I don't know exactly what's happening in that relationship. I wasn't there, and the narrator wasn't necessarily too concerned about explaining every little detail that we had questions for. But I wonder if this physical distance is representative of some sort of emotional distance within that relationship, because we know that there's some conflict between them. Okay, Genesis 24. Abraham wants to make sure I can find a wife for my son Isaac. So he sends his trusted servant on the servant promises to go and to take a quest to find a wife, goes to the well, finds Rebekah, sends the message to Rebekah. There's this moment where Rebekah makes a decision, and then Genesis 24 at the very end, then Isaac brought Rebekah into his mother Sarah's tent, who's just passed away. And he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. Thus Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So now we have the new matriarch in the family, Rebekah, coming in to live in the same tent where Sarah was, so that we know she's taking Sarah's place as a matriarch moving forward in this story. Genesis 25, Abraham takes on some other concubines, and takes on another wife, has some children, and then he sends those other children away, sends them east, gets them away from Isaac, so Isaac can be all by himself. He gives some of his other sons gifts, but Isaac receives the lion's share of his inheritance. Okay, this is Mark Wahlberg. Look at his shoulders, nice-looking shoulders. He works out. These are all actors. Here's Anthony Mackie. He was an Avenger, and here's The Rock, Dwayne Johnson. Like all three of them know their way around a weight room, right? Okay. So they look like pretty big individuals. If they were walking towards me on the street, I might consider crossing the other side of the street and continuing my journey. They look big. But let's see how big they look compared to other really big people. Over this hand side, on the right-hand side, we see Shaquille O'Neal and Charles Barkley. And look at this little 13-year-old right here, Mark Wahlberg. He still has his training wheels on. Look how small he looks compared to these other big boys. Even though in this picture he looked big, right? But compared to everyone else, he looks small. Okay, here is, anyone who this is DK Metcalf, big wide receiver for Seattle Seahawks. He's like 6'4", like 240, like 6% muscle fat. Fat, and the rest of it just pure muscle. Like he's scary. And here's Russell Wilson. He is one of the tallest receivers in the league right now. And look at his arms. He's a big boy, right? But let's put him up next to someone else who's an even bigger boy. Here he is. He looks like he's just asking his dad for some money so he can go to the ballpark to buy a Gatorade with his friends, right? This is Dikembe Mutombo from the NBA. He looks like a little kid, right? Who we stand next to in our family definitely shapes the way that other people see us. We can grow up in the same family as other siblings, but we grow up in different families because we experience that family differently. When we're looking at the story of Abraham, he's Abraham, the big patriarch, right? Then we have Isaac. Then we have all the adventures of Jacob / Israel. So many cool things happening. But Isaac, what do we know about Isaac? What kind of character is he? He's a favorite son. Good. What else? He had some ideas. Mm-hmm. He was the promised son, so there's a lot riding on him, right? But in the stories, he's fairly passive, right? In fact, the biggest story we know about him is like his son tricks him, right? In fact, before we even get a good story about him, his twins upstage him in the narrative. There's not much about Isaac. There's still a little bit, but there's not much. So sometimes Isaac is seen as this passive character. Isaac is the only patriarch to pray to God, at least mention in the Bible, to pray to God about his wife's infertility. So he does do that. He does a few other things as well. But we know that after Abraham dies and Ishmael defies, now there's this definite cut. Abraham has passed away, Sarah's passed away. Now it's clearly Isaac and Rebekah's show. Isaac prays to God on behalf of his wife, and then Rebekah says, "Why is this happening to me?" Because inside of her belly, she had 2 children that were struggling. So imagine this individual who is experiencing some infertility, and now there's these 2 little ones inside of her that are warring and kicking, and she's really concerned. Why is this happening to me? So Rebekah went to inquire of the Lord, and he declared to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. So God already saying the older will serve the younger. This is going to come later on in the story. And if you're interested, if you have your smartphones, this is going to be a picture of 2 babies struggling in the womb via ultrasound. So you can see this happening. So imagine this sort of thing happening in Rebekah's uterus. This happening. She's concerned about all of this tussle. This could actually be very dangerous, especially if we're thinking about what's to be happening with umbilical cords and how those can be wrapped around babies' necks. This is a real concern now that we know this, so this is what she's experiencing. 3, 2, 1, moving on. Okay, let's catch ourselves up at this genogram. So we have Isaac and Rebekah over here, and then we have Esau and Jacob, the twins, the famous twins. And when her time came to give birth, there were indeed twins in her womb. The first one came out red, covered with hair like a fur coat, and they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out grasping Esau's heel, and he was named Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when his twins were born. When the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter and man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man who stayed at the home, because Isaac had a taste for wild game, and he loved Esau. Rebekah loved Jacob. So it's clear that each parent had a favored son. So sometimes I imagine what it would be like doing family therapy with this biblical family. Think about the family dynamics and what people were willing to give up for what they want. It's clear that Esau is willing to give up his birthright in exchange for a bowl of soup, right? Now, the challenge with this is when this occurs in the family, there's no such thing as cup of noodles back then. No such thing as a single serving of Kraft macaroni and cheese. When you're making food, you're making lasagna. You're making a pot. So Jacob makes a pot of soup, pulls a big pan of lasagna out of the oven, and I promise you, either everyone was about to eat or they were going to eat, and I'm sure he did not charge everyone the same price that he charged Esau. Right? In fact, back then, one of the big values was hospitality, because there was no such thing as Airbnb or La Quinta or Holiday, and those things didn't exist. If you were going to travel, you relied on the hospitality of other people to survive. So we see Esau coming in from the hunt, and he's hungry, and he smells some food, and he comes in, and Jacob sees this, takes the opportunity. Instead of extending hospitality, he charges his brother this exorbitant price just for a pot of stew. And what is he actually getting? Let's just slow this down. So, if there were 10 brothers in a family, the firstborn would get his cut, then he would get his birthright, so he'd get a double portion. Then all of his other brothers would split up the remaining inheritance. It's on the left side. Because there's only 2 sons, the firstborn gets his, plus his birthright, and then whatever's left goes to the remaining son. So what's happening is, Jacob is trading his 1/3 of the inheritance for 2/3 of the inheritance. That's the exchange for some really, really good lentil stew and some garlic bread. That's what's happening. What type of family member would do this to a brother? A chum, you said? A chump. A chum or a chump? Yeah. So Jacob is a chum or a chump. That's what's happening in the story. Or being controlled. Oh, I'm glad you're talking about this control by proxy. We're going to definitely get into this because Jacob isn't the only one that's pulling strings, right? Rebecca is pulling some strings. He was a mama's boy. He was a man of the household, the tent hold. She taught him how to run the tents. So she is the one who is potentially, we know she's behind the other deception. Maybe, who knows? I wouldn't put it past her to say, you know what, every time your brother comes home, he's really hungry, he's famished, and he just wants to engulf his food. What if we take advantage of the situation? I wouldn't be surprised if she was behind this as well. Who knows? We do know a little bit about Isaac. Isaac also lies to the king of the Philistines, Abimelech, using the same exact lie that his father used about his wife, saying, oh, this is my sister, when it's really Rebekah, his wife, but he was caught canoodling with Rebekah. He actually digs some wells, and he grows some wheat, and he's become such a big clan that the Abimelech and the Philistines say, move away from us, we are afraid of you. And he grows wheat 100-fold. So this is saying that he can both do city folk stuff, digging wells and staying in one place and growing things, but he's also able to grow his herds and his cattle, so he's as a pastoral nomad. So Isaac can do all of it, but he just doesn't get to shine so much because he's right next to Abraham, Big Daddy, and then the big boy of Jacob, Jacob Israel. So I think that's why Isaac doesn't look as big. Then there's this deception via Rebekah. Rebekah is using Jacob by proxy to deceive her husband. This is really elder abuse of what's happening here. So there's all these questions. Who are you, my son? How is it that you have it so quickly, my son, from the hunt? Please come close that I may feel you, my son, whether you're really my son Esau or not. The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. Are you really my son Esau? So we get the sense that Isaac's like, something doesn't fit right. Asking something smells fishy here. But he goes through with it anyways. And there are major consequences for this family, right? Major consequences. And this is now the second generation where someone has to leave the family. The second generation where someone has to leave the family. In the previous generation, Ishmael and Hagar had to leave the family, right? And we know that decision to resolve the conflict has trickled down through generations and millennia. This is also something that we're thinking about how this family resolved conflict. Jacob had to be sent away, had to run away, but not before he got the blessing from his father. So now, he has the birthright because he tricked his brother for it. Now he swindled his father for the blessing, so in all intents and purposes, he's the eldest son. He has the blessing and the birthright. But he can't stay at home, he's not safe, so he runs away. And he runs away to Padamaran, where Rebekah's brother lives, right? Let's just keep it in the family, right? Just going to go up north, Padamaran. Jacob runs away. And it's clear that Esau is really upset. Esau says, "Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has betrayed me these 2 times. He took away my birthright," just so we're all aware of what's happened. Narrator's trying to keep us up to speed. "And behold, now he has taken away my blessing." And he said, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" Talking to his father. So Esau held a grudge against Jacob because the blessing which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, "The days of the mourning for my father are near. Then I will kill my brother Jacob." So he's like, I have 1/3 of the inheritance, and I don't have the blessing. And the blessing is linked with fertility. I'm missing out on those 2 things. And he is Pissed. He is really upset about this. So Jacob runs up north, Padamaran. We've been there before, right? Padamaran. Jacob meets tender-eyed Leah and beautiful Rachel, and he gets tricked. He gets 2 wives for the fair price of 14 years. So he works 7 years to marry his true love, and on the wedding night, Laban does a little switcheroo, right? Bait and switch, and Jacob's with Leah, wakes up in the morning, "Oh no, you're not the person I was supposed to marry." He goes to the father. Father's, "Wow, sorry, this is just the way we do things around here. We have to marry away the eldest." I don't know if that's true or not, but that's the story he told him. "But if you want to marry my youngest, you can do that, but then you have to work 7 more years." So he worked 7 years, married twice, and worked 7 more years. So Abraham lies to Pharaoh. He says, "This is my sibling," and he does this to save his own skin. Abraham is not that creative. He does the same thing later on. He lies to King Abimelech, and he says, "This is my sibling." Why? To save his own skin. If it's good for the goose, it might be good for the gander, because Isaac uses the same exact lie with the next king Abimelech, saying, "Me too. This is my sibling." Why? To save his own skin. Now, there's a little remix happening in the next generation. Look at this. Jacob, prompted by Rebekah, lies to Isaac, saying, "I am my sibling, and here is his skin." But it doesn't just happen in this family. It also happens over in Padamaran, because Leah, prompted by Laban, lies to Jacob, saying, "Me too, I am my sibling, and here's her skin." This family is using the exact same playbook. So we see it happening with Laban. We see it happen with Rebekah, because they are cut from the same cloth. They were in the same family of origin. We see the same pattern passed down. Every behavior is a symptom of the system, and this is one way this family tries to get through things. So God still blessed tender-eyed Leah, gave her some children, and you look at the different names of the children. The first few children are about trying to get her husband's affection. Then when it comes to Judah, she says, "This time I'll praise the Lord," that's his name. And so she changes the way that she names her children after that point in time. Because it's clear that Jacob prefers Rachel, right? Does not prefer Leah. And Leah is feeling that. She's trying to name her boys about what's happening, hoping she can get her husband's affection. Because in Genesis 30, we have more infertility wars. Now we have 2 sisters. One of them is beautiful. The other one is tender-eyed or doe-eyed Leah. One of them, Leah, has more children, but Rachel doesn't have as many. And I can only imagine how those 2 sisters got along or didn't get along within that marital relationship. And there's these infertility wars happening. And now in the days of the wheat harvest, Reuben, who is the eldest son of Leah, went and found mandrakes in the field and brought these mandrakes to his mother Leah, making it super clear, bringing these mandrakes to my mother Leah. Then Rachel, the enemy sister, said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she, that's Leah, said to her, "Is it a small matter for you to take my husband? And would you take my son's mandrakes also?" So Rachel said, "Therefore, he may lie with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes." All right. Anyone know what a mandrake is? It's a plant. It's a root. Okay, tell me more. Had to do with fertility. Yes. Oh, man. I didn't need to come up here. You already know this. Yes, it absolutely had to do with fertility. Let's take a look. These are mandrakes. Here's what's at the top. Look at these roots at the bottom. They look pretty anthropomorphic, right? You can see the head, the arms, the legs. In different cultures, mandrakes were definitely linked with fertility because they're pulled from the earth, right? So they could be worn as amulets. They could also be cut up and put into tea to drink because there are specific properties to these mandrakes. Mandrakes are actually deliriant hallucinogenic tropane alkaloids. They're drugs. So Rachel is saying, look, can I have some of those fertility drugs to help me? And Leah is saying, look, you want the drugs too, but you already have my husband? And so Rachel says, okay, I'll give you one night with our husband if you give me these fertility drugs. So Leah's in this tough spot. Do I keep these fertility drugs that my son brought me to help me get pregnant? But it's really difficult to get pregnant without my partner, right? So Rachel is pimping out her husband for fertility drugs. This is how bad she wants to get pregnant. There's this Pashto proverb, I was swift in my revenge. I only waited 100 years. The question is, Jacob's been up in Padamaran this whole time. He's eventually going to return home. How is Esau going to receive him? And if you remember the story, I'm getting some tingles. When he comes, he sends his servants and his cattle and his wives ahead of him to Esau, saying, these are gifts, these are gifts, these are gifts, because he's worried about his own skin. That's what he's worried about. Genesis 31, Jacob runs with his family to Canaan. And in fact, he's caught by, where are my idols, Laban? There's this story in Genesis 31 where Jacob and Leah and Rachel decide to run away from Padamaran, and Laban realizes that his household gods were taken from him. So he runs after them. He says, why'd you take my household gods? And Jacob says, what? We didn't do that. You can look anywhere. He swears up and down that he didn't take it. So Laban looks all around, and inside one of the tents, Rachel is sitting on a camel saddle, and says, sorry, Dad, you can't come in here because it's my time of the month. I'm menstruating. You can't come in here. So he says, okay, I can't come in here. But she's sitting on the idols. Now, we know that Jacob is a trickster, right? But he's swearing up and down that he has no idea where these idols are. I think there's something that happening we see several chapters later where he actually might have known what was happening. He's not the only character that swears up and down in the Bible about not knowing something. Remember the story of Peter in the court of the high priest saying, I'm not with that Nazarene. How dare you? I didn't do that. That's not me. I don't know that man. Swearing up and down what he actually did, right? So I think this actually comes up later on the narrative when we look at Jacob's reaction to these family idols. So Jacob is afraid of Esau's 400. He wrestles with God. He gets a new name. His name is now Israel. And he reunites with Esau in Genesis 33. And if you read Genesis 33 again, compare that to the story of Luke, the prodigal son. There are very clear parallels between that. I think actually Jesus was inspired by this story when you're thinking about the prodigal son story. So then there's the story of Dinah, the sexual assault of Dinah, and the prince of Shechem. And what happens is the prince of Shechem sexually assaults Dinah, and then the prince of Shechem comes and says, what can I do? I'll pay you whatever I want so I can marry her. At the very end of the narrative, we find out that Dinah is actually held captive in Shechem this whole time. And so the sons don't like how Israel is taking this very passive approach. So the son says, sure, we'll make a deal with you. You and everyone else in Shechem will get circumcised. And the prince says, deal, we'll do it. And after they're circumcised, then we see Levi and Simeon go in and they get revenge and they kill everybody. In Israel's response, Jacob, notice how he's called Jacob here, not Israel. Sometimes in the narrative he goes back and forth between Jacob and Israel. I think part of that has to do with his behavior in that particular story. And Jacob says to Simeon and Levi, you have brought trouble upon me, my own skin, by making me a stench to the Canaanites and Perizzites, the people of this land. Notice this people in the land again. There's these themes all the way through. We are few in number. If they unite against me and attack me, I and my household will be destroyed. But they replied, should he have treated our sister like a prostitute? So what's happening here, Jacob is more concerned about his own skin than protecting his daughter. But his sons are protecting his daughter. So there's actually a critique on who Jacob is as a father and as a protector in this story. there's quite a bit of violence in this family. A lot of violence. We kind of gloss over some of this violence, some of these family dynamics. Why? Most of the time when we're talking about the narrative of Genesis, we're interested in how God is interacting with humanity, and we're contrasting the character of God with the characters of humanity, and we're trying to show the differences and like how we can have more faith and we can learn and grow in Christ, and how God's promises, how that harkens forward to the New Testament. That's usually what we're interested in. But by doing this, we're looking at what's happening in the family, and we're actually able to start pulling apart and untangling some of these patterns that we've seen in the narrative before, and we'll actually be putting it to paper as we get forward, moving forward and looking at the genogram. So the big question here is, what is Jacob/Israel about now? Is he interested in tricking other people? No, now at this stage of his life, he's interested in just trying to preserve himself. He's not interested in protecting his family, because maybe he didn't learn how to do that. Genesis 35, Jacob takes and buries the family idols, and there's no surprise of, what are these? Where'd we get these family's idols from? He just buries them. There's no commentary, so I wonder if Jacob and Rachel were in cahoots about this. Rachel dies as Benjamin is born. Reuben sleeps with Bilhah, which is a concubine of Rachel, and this is an attack on the father saying, this is kind of like ownership, I'm going to do this, and you're not going to do anything about it. And it's true, Israel is very passive. At the very end of his life, he actually curses some of his sons, but in the moment, he does not stand up to his sons. Jacob is again renamed Israel a second time. Jacob sees his father Isaac again, but he never ever sees Rebekah. So his mother, who had a favorite son, sends him away, never gets to see her favorite son again. Genesis 36, Esau's descendants, the Edomites, are mentioned. Genesis 27, we have Joseph, who dreams, and brothers who scheme. So now here we are, we have Leah and Zilpah, we have Jacob in the middle, Rachel and Bilhah, and then we have these sons down here. So Gad and Asher are the biological sons of Zilpah and Jacob. Leah and Jacob end up having Dinah, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Jacob and Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin, and Dan and Naphtali, Bilhah and Jacob. Again, there's not a big critique about which sons came from which biological mothers, even though we made a big deal about it before with Sarah and Hagar. Joseph is different from his brothers in several different ways. One, he's a snitch. He tells on his brothers. He brings information about what happened. He's a tattletale. He brought bad report to his father about how his brothers were behaving. He is clearly Israel's favorite. He has a special coat. In the biblical text say that Jacob loved Joseph. He's the firstborn of Israel's favorite wife, right? And he's gifted with a coat of many colors. He is not assigned the same labor responsibilities. If you remember the story, all the other sons are out in the fields doing shepherd work, and he's chilling at home with Dad. And Dad says, go check on the brothers for me. You just go check on them and come back. He's not given the same labor responsibilities, and we know that he has dreams, right? So all these things separate him from his brothers. And it might actually be difficult to live with Joseph because he's such the preferred son, gets special treatment. In fact, Genesis 34:7 says, and his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, and so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. They could not get along with him.
He was probably really good looking too, because Rachel was really beautiful.
Ooh, I like this.
Leah wasn't as beautiful.
Uh-huh.
So that was also why Potiphar's wife met.
Yes. Oh, I'm getting some. Yes. He could have inherited some of that beauty. In Genesis 39, is it? When Potiphar's wife takes attention to him? Okay, I should probably put that on here, huh? Maybe next time. If you go to the next church I present this, there'll be a new bullet point on here to show that he is suave, good looking. Okay. So, even animals are not safe when this family wants something for themselves. What does this mean? In the previous story of Jacob tricking his father Isaac, he kills an animal, right? He puts the skin on him, cooks the animal, gives it to his father. These sons also kill an animal, put it on the clothing of Joseph, and then bring the bloody clothing to Israel, saying, your son has passed away. The brothers had many different options. They could have told Joseph to stop saying that he's better than them. Maybe just steal his coat, that's it. maybe tell their father that favoritism is hurtful, but instead they decide to take Joseph and sell him into slavery, and that's the way they resolve a problem. So now we have the third generation of how to resolve problems. We get rid of the person we don't like. So this is just a reiteration of this same exact pattern. Joseph seems to have some prescient knowledge about what's happening. There's this interlude with Joseph and Tamar. Joseph, he's imprisoned by all the brothers, and he keeps Simeon hostage. He sent money back in sacks, but they eventually run out of food again. So what happens is these sons come down to Egypt during a famine. And the viceroy of Egypt, which is Joseph, meets them, has a conversation with them. And then he sends the sons back with all the food up to Canaan, and he puts the money back in the sacks. So as the boys are going back to Canaan with all this food, they realize the money's in the sacks, and they think, oh boy, what do we do? It's going to look like we stole this. So they end up going back home and have a conversation with their father. And one of the big things that they have to contend with is Joseph was asking the viceroy of Egypt was asking a lot of questions about their family, including this younger brother, the supposed younger brother, saying, well, if you come again, bring your younger brother. You got to bring your younger brother again. So Joseph seats them in birth order when they actually end up showing up down in Egypt the second time, seats them in birth order, and give Benjamin 5 times the amount of food. And so all the sons like, wow, how does this person know all this? This person must have special divination magic. In fact, we see later on that he sends them away with food the second time, and he actually puts the cup used for divination into Benjamin's sack. So the brothers and the boys are going back up to Canaan the second time, and Joseph sends his servant running after them. Whoa, stop. Somebody stole the viceroy of Egypt's divination cup. Can we look in your sacks? And all the others said, no, sure, go ahead. We didn't steal it. So the servant looks in everybody's sacks, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Issachar, all the way across, finally opens up Benjamin's sack, and inside Benjamin's sack is this divination cup. So, how do the boys respond when they find out that he has the divination cup? Anyone remember? They tear their clothes. Good. We've been waiting several chapters for this. Why? They tore Joseph's clothes and dipped it in blood to give to the father. The father saw this. He tore his clothes, right? And then coming up over here, finally, these brothers are tearing their clothes. Why is this important? I think Joseph is testing what's happening in the family. Because if I was these brothers, and I didn't like Benjamin because Benjamin is the last child of my father's favorite wife, it would be a real slick cover story to come home without Benjamin and say, Dad, I'm so sorry, but he must have stolen the divination cup. And the viceroy of Egypt said that he has to stay down there. He's punished. We couldn't do anything about that. How could we stand up to Egypt? I'm sorry, he did this. We're going to come home with the food. That's the best we could do. Instead, they tear their clothes and say, no, you're not taking him back. We're all going back. So the brothers have a very different response to a favored son compared to several chapters beforehand. Okay. Bird's eye view of Abraham's family. Let's go back to these questions. We'll try and find some answers. What are some of Abraham's family rules? What are the intergenerational patterns of behavior? How do people handle anxiety and tension? Who are the villains? Who are the heroes? Here we go. So here's the genogram. Now we're going to start putting some of those relational lines over this, and let's see what happens. Now we've gone through the whole story, almost the whole story. Defiance. These are the individuals who show defiance. Hagar, Ishmael, Esau, Gad, Asher, and these other 6 sons. These are the individuals who show defiance. These are the individuals who are lying. Abraham, Sarai, Isaac, Rebekah, Laban, all these individuals. So all these people are lying, it's these brothers down here. But all these people are defiant. Who are usually cast as the villains in this story? Who are the bad guys? The D's, the defiant ones, they're the bad guys, right? Potentially. But they're not the ones who are lying. Down here they are. But up here they're not. In fact, Hagar was kind of forced into it, right? Ishmael is kicked away with just because he's a biological son of his mother. Esau is not the favorite son. He gets swindled and tricked. But sometimes they're seen as the bad ones. What about these sons down here? These sons that end up trying to take Joseph, sell him into slavery, rip up his robe, dip it in blood, and then trick his father. Are these seen as evil, bad guys? For part of the story, good. Tell me why. Why would they be seen as the villains, the bad guys, for part of the story? Yeah. Got rid of this person and lied to their dad. But notice, that's no different from anything else that happened in previous generations. Lying to someone and getting rid of someone in the family. They were doing the exact same thing that the previous generations were doing. Every behavior is a symptom of the system. Here's conflict. Conflict in the family. Quite a bit of conflict in this family. So we have defiance, lying, conflict. We have favoritism towards the youngest offspring. A lot of favoritism. In each generation, there's favoritism towards the youngest offspring. We have extreme manipulation in this family. Extreme manipulation. We have cutoffs. People are kicked out. Hagar runs away from Sarah, runs back, and then Sarah kicks out Hagar and Ishmael out of the family. Jacob runs away from Esau, and then he runs away from Laban, right? Because there's too much distress. He's running away. And then Joseph is sold away. So one way this family resolves conflict is to cut someone out of the family. Now, when you cut someone away from the family, does the anxiety suddenly disappear? No. I sometimes wonder if Abram is running from something, and I think he was running from some infertility. He was looking for a solution that he was not able to find in Paddan-aram. So this unrepaired rift here between Ishmael and Isaac, we still feel those reverberations now. The earth is not completely, but a lot of the known world is split along those lines. The descendants of Ishmael, the descendants of Isaac. So when you cut someone out of the family, it doesn't resolve the anxiety. It just stays latent and it's underneath the surface, or gets redistributed amongst the rest of the family members. So, who are the villains? Who are the heroes? I would say that some of these heroes, like Jacob, could actually be cast as a villain, depending how you see him. Yes?
I think one point where we don't look at very much is that Isaac was the son of the promise,
Mm-hmm.
heaven,
Yep.
whereas Ishmael was the son of the flesh. And that's the two groups of people that are present today.
Yes, but they're both biological sons, right? And we don't have Lot in there. If we're going to have Lot as well, let's round out this. We have 3 boys here in the story. And just because one person is the son of the promise doesn't mean that they're necessarily more important than the other sons. In that family, they definitely wanted some biological sons. And Sarah was very intent on making sure her son was the only one, to the extent that she wanted to kick out this other biological child. Not hers, but a biological child of her husband. That's the way she wanted to resolve the conflict.
Do you think that's why Abraham he was always resentful of her and didn't live with her at the end of the
I don't know. I don't know. There's like big jumps in the story, right? Big jumps in the story.
But like what you pointed out with him dragging his feet about letting him go,
Right. It's clear he did not want to send Ishmael away.
it seemed like he probably, and it was her idea.
It was her idea. It was her idea. And the reason she was doing this, because we'll talk about triangles tomorrow, she was having conflict with Hagar, and because she had conflict with Hagar and conflict with Ishmael, she triangled Abraham into it to deal with the problem. So there's always conflict in the marital unit. Every single generation experienced conflict in the marital unit. Every single generation, the younger son receives the blessing. Every single generation, there's conflict between the siblings. So right now, would you like to invite this family over for Thanksgiving dinner?
It'd be interesting.
Could be interesting. Pastor Vince, how would you feel about having this family be a part of this church? That's a trick. Yeah? Because this is not the only family that looks like this, right? A lot of us have families that might smell like this or remind us like this. We all come from systems that have dysfunction. There's no family that has no dysfunction. And if there's a family that has no dysfunction, that means they're keeping secrets. And secrets are a way to bind anxiety in the system, so that means they're covering something up. A lot of our families are going to look like this, but we just see the one person. But every behavior is a symptom of the system. And the big rule in this family seems to be do whatever is expedient now. I do it now for me, and I'm going to worry about the consequences later. And this sometimes happens in our families as well. I'm going to do whatever I think I need to do now. Survival mode now, not worried about the consequences down the road. And when we do that, if we're not thinking about the consequences down the road, we might think we don't have to deal with it, but future generations are going to have to deal with it. With Sarah thinking, if I send Hagar and Ishmael away, maybe for thousands of years after that, there's going to be conflict between these two lines of people. Probably not. She was just thinking, I just want to get this out of here. She was so upset that she used getting rid of someone as a way to solve her tension. Whatever we refuse to acknowledge, we will undoubtedly and unconsciously pass on to other people. So the first thing, if you want to make changes, we have to see that every behavior is a symptom of the system. And we are patterned individuals. We do things in patterns. If we want to change a pattern, we want to change a behavior, we have to see how that behavior is part of a pattern, part of a system. Could be the family system. It could be the church system. It could be the school system. So I'm going to go out on a limb here. So you're the principal at the nearby school, is that right? Yes. Okay. Let's say there's a third grade boy. Let's make it a girl. Third grade girl she's acting out in the classroom. What?
They immediately think of someone in between.
Yeah. We have in third grade, this girl who's acting out. She's not able to stay in her seat. She's fidgeting. She's making noise. She's not listening. She's disruptive. She's always going over and sharpening her pencil. She's trying to pull out books when it's not time to do readings time. She's just distracting the whole classroom. If I was interested in behavior modification, I would be asking the question, how do we get this girl to sit in her seat and pay attention? If I'm interested in just behavior modification. But if I see her behaviors as a symptom of the system, I would ask questions like, okay, what's happening at home that's contributing to this? What's happening in the classroom that is contributing to this? Oh, I noticed that she's in the back, she's farther away from the teacher, and she's around some other disruptive people, and she's near the window, she's getting distracted looking outside, and she's fidgeting in her chair. Let's see how she's sitting in her chair to see if that chair is comfortable for her. Let's find if she has some specific sensory needs in the classroom that might need to be addressed. Because if we can see her behavior as a symptom of the system, maybe we can change some of the system rules so that she can sit on a chair that's more comfortable for her. Maybe she can have special timeouts, like, okay, Sally, if you need a break, here are 3 things you can do. You can walk over here and sit on a beanbag for a few minutes. You can go over here and you can get a drink of water. Or you can go over to this wall that has some breathing techniques, and you can do one of these 2 breathing techniques, and then you can go back and sit down. In fact, we're also going to put you at the front, maybe on the front left-hand side, so maybe the teacher does most of the instruction over here. Put her on the left-hand side, so she has a little bit more space, and the kids aren't necessarily always looking at her. They're looking in another direction. And in doing so, we start giving her breaks, space when she needs a new sensory palette. She needs to get some more breath. In fact, during recess, when everyone's come back for recess, the teacher always says, Sally, run to the fence and run back. So she uses extra energy to run there and run back, so she gets more sensory needs. She gets some of the heavy input from running. And in doing so, we give her a little bit of space to express some of her unmet sensory needs. And in doing so, she might be more attentive in the classroom. That's seeing the behavior as a symptom of the system instead of how do we stop this person from behaving badly. At the very beginning of this presentation, we looked at Roxy. Roxy was the source of a lot of conflict in the family. Instead of saying, what's wrong with Roxy? We ask, how did Roxy learn how to do this? Because she learned it somewhere. And every behavior is a symptom of the system. When we look at life satisfaction between Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, let's look at this, Genesis 25:7. These are all the years of Abraham's life that he lived, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man and satisfied with life. And he was gathered to his people. Let's look at the next generation. Genesis 35:28. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years old. Then Isaac breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people, an old man of ripe age. And his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. What's different between these two right now? Right, Abraham was satisfied with life. There's no mention of satisfaction down here for Isaac. Let's look at the next generation. This is Jacob going to King Pharaoh. And Pharaoh had just asked him about his life. And Jacob said, the years of my living abroad are 130. Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life. Look at the difference between the generations. This is what happens when there's unresolved tension in the family that is just passed down to the next generation. The next generation inherits this unresolved tension as part of their experience. And if they don't resolve that anxiety, that's all going to get kicked down to the next generation. So a lot of stuff we deal with now isn't new to us. It's been passed down, both the behaviors that we've learned and the anxiety that we inherit. Yes?
Is that necessarily noticeable internally as the family's experiencing it, or don't they just think that's how life is because that's what they know?
Good. So see if I understand this correctly. So does each generation go, wow, this is worse than the previous generation? Or do they just think, oh, this is just the way that life is now? They're just used to it because this is the new norm for them. Right? And when you look at the story, things get messier and messier down the generations. Messier and messier down the generations. Too many people spend their lives being dutiful descendants instead of good ancestors. The responsibility of each generation is not to please their predecessors, it's to improve things for their offspring. It's more important to make your children proud than your parents proud. Sometimes we think we're trying to preserve what we learn in our family of origin, but oftentimes our ancestors would actually prefer that we do things differently. It's just that we just do what we learn, monkey see, monkey do, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. In Genesis 48, near the end of the story, the swapping of the hands, there's this story where when it was told to Jacob, behold, your son Joseph has come to you, Israel collected his strength and sat up in bed. So Israel's old man, seasoned, he sits up in bed and he's talking to his son. Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz, the land of Canaan, and blessed me. And he said to me, behold, I will make you fruitful and numerous. I will make you a multitude of peoples. And I will give you this land to your descendants. Notice this echo of people and land, family and land, as an everlasting possession. And then he does this really interesting interlude. He says, now your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, so the two sons you had before I came to visit you, before I realized you were even alive, those two sons are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are. He's saying, I'm adopting these two sons as mine. But your children that you have fathered after them shall be yours. They shall be called the names of your brothers and your inheritance. Now, as for me, when I came from Paddan Aram, what is he doing now? He's talking about the sons he just officially adopted, Joseph's two sons, and then he goes off on this tangent immediately after adopting these two sons. Now, as for me, when I came from Paddan, Rachel died, to my sorrow, in the land of Canaan on the journey, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath, and I buried her there on their way to Ephrath. Why is he talking about Rachel here? He's talking about inheriting these two sons, then he talks about Rachel. What I think is happening here, here we go. There we go. What I think is happening here, he adopted these two sons from Joseph because his favorite wife died while giving childbirth. if he adopts these two sons from Joseph, whose sons are they going to be? His, but coming from the line of Rachel. So he's adopting these two sons and putting them under Rachel's name, because Rachel only had two sons. I think he's taking these two and giving some more to Rachel in her name. Now the eyes of Israel were so dim from age that he could not see, and Joseph brought these two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, close to him, and he kissed them, embraced them, and Israel said to Joseph, I have never expected to see your face, and behold, God has let me see your children as well. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand towards Israel's left, and Manasseh with his left hand toward Israel's right, and brought them close to him. But Israel reached out his right hand, and placed it on the head of Ephraim, who is younger, and his left hand, Manasseh's hand, crossing his hands, although Manasseh was the firstborn. So this narrator is taking painstaking effort to make sure we're seeing the story of Joseph bringing the eldest and youngest son, Ephraim and Manasseh, before his father, youngest and eldest, and his father, instead of going like this to bless them, he crosses his arms to bless them. So he blesses the younger one. Imagine this happening the previous generation. Here's what happened. So Joseph sees this, and it displeased him. And he grabbed his father's hand to move them, to uncross them. And Joseph said to his father, not so, my father, you're doing it wrong. For this one is the firstborn. Place your right hand on his head. But his father, Israel, said, I know, my son, I know. He will also become a people, and he will also be great. However, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. Imagine what would have happened if Isaac would have sent out Esau to get some food, brought him back, and God has already told them that the younger will serve the older. And when Esau comes in, if Isaac would have said, okay, hold on a second, let's bring in Jacob as well. So Jacob and Esau are both there. And he goes to bless them. Let's imagine Jacob crossing his hands, blessing the younger. Esau protests, I don't like this, not so, Dad. This is not the way we're supposed to do it. And he says, I know. You will also become a people. But your younger brother is even greater. His brother would have protested, there would have been upsetness, but then that would have been it. And Jacob would not have had to run away. And that family would not have had to broken up. And Rachel would have been able, and Rebecca would have been able to stay with her favorite son. But instead, that's not what happened. But if this would have happened, that family would not have had to be destroyed. So, closing theological reflections, then we have Vince walk around with the microphone, because I'm sure I missed stuff, and I want to make sure I can hear from y'all what are some things that I missed that you suggest that I include or think about in future iterations of this presentation. But first, some closing theological reflections. 1, God chose to remake and initially make his covenant with this family. He did not choose a pristine, pure family, did he? Even though they continued these behaviors, God still chose to make his covenant with this type of people. 2, these people, this family, work really hard, even take advantage of each other, to obtain or protect God's already promised blessing to them. They spend a lot of energy doing that. And sometimes they even put that promise in jeopardy. Jacob ran away to pat him around. That's not where God promised his family. He promised his family Canaan. But he runs away, and then he has to run away back. People are not wanting to stay in the same place. God works even harder to not let our dysfunction ruin his covenant with us. It's righteousness by faith for a reason. It is not based on work. This family is not a pristine, pure family. In fact, you might feel a little bit uncomfortable sending one of your offspring over to their house to play. But a lot of families look like this, even maybe perhaps our own. And our dysfunction does not scare God. Fierce covenant loyalty, the hesed from the divine towards the humanity, is contrasted with the family loyalty in Abraham's family, which is not really loyalty at all. If I don't like you, if you've done something against me, I'm going to get rid of you. That is not how God treats us. If we do something to God, he does not get rid of us. He pursues us to remake his covenant with us. Sometimes the actions of one person can change the family tree. Joseph was kicked out as a family. But he was away from that mess for a while, right? And he ends up seeming to be a different individual from the rest of the family. Does that family change over time? Yes, there seems to be some evidence of some changed behavior, like the brothers ripping their clothes instead of letting Benjamin go down back to Egypt. But it's clear that Joseph is different from his family. He makes different choices. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the best thing we can do is get a little bit of distance between us and the dysfunction. Is that a permanent solution? Careful, because in this family, the permanent solutions were get rid of this person or run away. And that's not a good long-term solution. It's a good short-term solution, but every time you take a short-term solution and spread it out over a long period of time, you're going to have challenges. So often we're not getting out of dysfunctional emotional or behavioral patterns until we get clear of toxic systems, so families, organizations, churches, relationships, in which we're enmeshed. It's hard to heal when the relational oxygen we're breathing every day is polluted. It's hard to think straight and behave differently when we're still closely enmeshed with that dysfunctional system, because every behavior is a symptom of that system. And sometimes we need a little bit of space from that system in order to change some of our behavior. Jeremiah 31:29. In those days, they will not say again, the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. So what stuff did you notice in Abraham's family that I missed? How might this change the way you see Abraham's family, and how might this change the way you see your family or romantic relationships? Now we can have the microphone. So what did I miss? How might this change the way you see Abraham's family, or how does this change the way you see your own family?
Do you think that the members, say 2 or 3 generations down, knew the history of the family and how things had been done?
The same behavior patterns are often passed down to the next generation.
Right, but do you think the generations realize how that came down to them?
Oh, yeah. I would not be surprised, because especially in the biblical narrative, they talk about the fathers. That's very important, how God first came to Abraham, and then remade his covenant with Isaac, and then again with Jacob/Israel. So it's clear that this family knows that God is creating this covenant with them, and I would not be surprised if they knew the stories about how this all came to be. Hey, Dad, do you have a brother? Well, sort of, but my mom kicked him out, and now he's in the desert somewhere. Hey, where's your twin? Oh, I don't spend time with my twin anymore. He ran away. Where was that? Didn't you have a brother that had fancy clothes? Oh, yeah, we kicked him out. So there are clear stories in the family that would definitely be passed down. So they would definitely know some of these behaviors.
So I see, if I translate that to my own personal family, and you might address this later, I don't know very much history. So how do you, if you have issues, how do you figure out if you don't know what the past really was in your family?
Oh, good question. If you don't know that far back,
Yeah.
how can you gain insight into whatever you're doing to know whether what you're doing is part of that pattern, if you can't even see the pattern? Is that right?
Yes.
What is your name?
Deborah.
Deborah, thank you. Oh, yes, thank you, Deborah. So let's pretend, so do you have any other family members that are currently alive?
No, just one brother now.
One brother, okay. But your brother, ask your brother what you do when you get upset. Do you think he would know?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah,
Probably.
okay. And do you think your upsettedness, the way you display your upsettedness, do you think that's completely unique to Deborah?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I really don't. I mean, because
If-
I don't communicate much with my brother, and everybody else in my family is gone.
So if we had more time, I'd sit down with you and get curious about, so in your family growing up, when people were upset, what did that look like? How did your family resolve conflict or not resolve conflict? Who had more power in the family? Who had less power? How did your parents pay attention to you or not? How did you and your brother get along or not? And what are some of those patterns? And do you happen to see any of those patterns playing out in the way you interact with other people today? Because even if we can't see back 4 generations, we might have some connection back one previous generation. Have you ever heard of something called epigenetics? Epigenetics is when our genome can actually shift and change because of trauma. There are certain tags in our genome that can be turned on or off. And depending on how much trauma I experience in life, my genes will actually physiologically change, and I can pass that down to the next generation. And they will inherit some of those genes. And they will inherit genes based off of what I experienced trauma-wise and tension-wise, even though they were never a part of it. So we don't just pass down behavior patterns. Genetically, some of the consequences of the trauma and conflict we experience are also passed down. So every one of us, genetically, are experiencing the afterburn, the shadow, the effects of previous generations' trauma. Yes.
I didn't hear what you said.
Yeah, I want to make sure we can hear on the microphone.
Oh, didn't God sometimes say it would curse them to like the fourth generation?
Right.
Certain things would happen.
I think he's not necessarily talking about the divine coming in and cursing you, but what happens in our body physiologically. The behavior and genomes can be passed down to subsequent generations as an effect of what we experienced. Yes.
I have a comment or observation
Yep.
referring to your point number 3.
Yep.
And I don't know if this is passable or not, if that's a term, but the silent treatment in families.
Uh-huh.
As a really young child, I think my father used to do that as a form of, showing that he was disappointed at something I did. And I was really little, it wasn't like all the time, but I see me do it sometimes
Yeah.
to my husband.
Yes.
Yeah.
We all have behavior patterns that we engage in when we're upset. And sometimes silent treatment is seen as, well, at least I'm not like chewing you out. At least I'm not hitting you. At least I'm not swearing at you. But silent treatment, I've done the silent treatment as well, and I've witnessed it, and I've helped families with it. Silent treatment is a form of emotional abuse. Silent treatment is a form of emotional abuse. And what happens is, I'm so upset with what's happening. I can't stand this tension. The only thing I can do is turn my back on you, throw up this emotional wall called stonewalling. I'm passive aggressive. We'll hear about that in the sermon tomorrow. So I can do some of this. And it's a way to let the other person know that I'm upset with you, I'm punishing you, because I don't know how to handle this, and that is definitely something that is passed down from generation to generation. I've learned that. So if we know this is part of our family, we know this is a pattern, we can intentionally lean away from that. If I know my go-to response is to throw up this emotional wall, if I know that's what I tend to do, and I know this is a pattern in my life, I can intentionally orient myself directly against that and try and stay firm and not do that, even though every bone in my body, every fiber of my being wants to turn and give you the silent treatment, because that's what I'm used to. That's what I'm familiar with. But if I know that's a pattern, every behavior is a symptom of the system. So we can actually, if we understand what's happening, oh, this behavior is part of a pattern. Oh, this is kind of semi-predictable, right? So if this is predictable, I got to prepare myself and do anything except for that next time. I don't care what it is. Do anything but this. And in doing so, I'll create a little bit more space, and I'll respond to other people in my family a little bit differently. Sometimes it just takes intentionally doing something different from before. And in doing so, create more space for your family. How does that fit? Yeah. Okay, good. What stuff did you notice in Abraham's family that I missed? How might this change the way you see Abraham's family? And how might this change the way you see your family romantic relationship?
I think it's fascinating to look through this and see how there are people in various settings who change the way things are controlled and how they want to control what happens next. And a lot of the behaviors we choose sometimes are a way of controlling
Yes.
the people around us. But the other thing that really strikes me with this story, when you look at all the ins and outs, and I've never looked at, the way all the generations go together, it's just amazing how God can use these deceitful, wicked, manipulative people for his purpose. And man, what hope does that give us?
Yes. Yes. He can use Abraham's family mafia for his good, right? A lot of things we do when we're upset are linked with our fight, flight, and freeze but responses. We see something we don't like, we perceive that as a threat, and it's the perception of a threat that sends us into fight, flight, or freeze. And all of a sudden, we're fighting, either physically, or we have a sharp tongue, or we're freezing, we're not moving, or our mind goes blank, or we're flighting, we're running away, which means either physically running away or throwing up this emotional wall because we're perceiving this threat. And sometimes we don't get to think, should I fight right now? Should I run away? Should I keep my mouth shut? It's instantaneous. Our body makes this instantaneous decision to try and keep us in a place where we are surviving this tension. Our body's not concerned with long-term consequences. It's concerned with immediate responses to whatever I'm not liking. So some of our responses are linked with this perception of a threat.
Is that trainable though, or is that set?
You can bring.
Is that trainable? Is that instinct thing, can it change?
Can we change that instinct? Good question. Okay. I'll try and give you a brief answer. Okay. Okay. So go ahead, if you can put your hands like this and put your fingers over the thumb, and if you put two hands together like this is roughly the size of your brain. You can put this right inside your skull. So here's a cross section of that. So here's one half of the brain. So coming out of the spinal cord right here, this is some people call it the reptilian brain or the survival brain. This is just right at the base of your skull spinal cord. This is the part of your brain that is dealing with automatic things, automatic responses like heart rate. Breathing. Most of the time, I don't have to think too much about breathing. My lungs just move, which is good because if I went to sleep and this wasn't on, I had difficulty breathing, right? There's also part of the body that sends you into fight, flight, or freeze, or befriend. So instantaneous responses. So fighting, flighting, running away, freezing, or befriending. Befriending is actually another response. Sometimes it's called fawning. Imagine that there's a woman in a war zone, and she hears this knock on the door. She opens the door, and some occupying soldiers. Instead of fighting them, running away, or freezing, she might try and befriend this potential threat. Come in, sit down. Do you want some food? Do you want some water? Do you want some eggs? Because if I can befriend this potential threat, then maybe myself and my kids won't be hurt by this potential threat. Bryan has done fighting, flighting, running away, freezing, and befriending. I have done all four of those in my life. I have some favored responses, though, that I'm more used to. And what happens is when I perceive there's a threat, I store that information in this big filing cabinet called the hippocampus. And right here is my limbic system. This is the seat of my emotions. And in my limbic system, I have this hippocampus where I store information. I also have this radar for threats called the amygdala. And the amygdala all day long is sweeping for threats. That's its only job. Whenever it perceives a threat, it says, ding, 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 threat alert. Let's send you into fight, flight, or freeze, and let's store that information down the road so the next time we see this similar sort of thing that we don't like, we know to send the alarm bells off. And when we perceive there's a threat, we flip our lid. This part of our brain right here that helps us do taxes and solve problems and be creative, this goes offline. Instead, we become hyper-focused on the problem. We can't see the context. We can't see solutions. Instead, we're in this fight, flight, or freeze, and we can't think straight. We have phrases in the English language like, get a hold of yourself. You're acting crazy. Calm down. Because we know when someone is upset that they're not acting like themselves, right? This happens a lot in our relationships. We see something we don't like. We perceive it as a threat because it matches other things we have in our filing cabinet, things that were unpleasant. And we react to that. We're not just reacting to that. We're also reacting to this other stuff in our filing cabinet that is cross-referenced with other things. Wherever there is a reaction, there's a wound. So when we are reacting to our friend, our family, our partner, our family, we are reacting to a wound that has not been healed. And we all have wounds, and we all have reactions. And those are usually patterned. They're not sudden, they're part of a pattern. Yes?
How would we understand those verses about God favoring Joseph in the narrative?
Ask it again in a different way.
In the verses with Joseph's story, it talks about God showing Joseph favor. So how do we align that with the family genogram?
Okay. Didn't God also show favor to Abraham and also to Isaac and also to Jacob and Israel? God doesn't always discern character in the same way we do. God sees us for who we are as his children, not necessarily our dysfunction. We know God uses flawed individuals for his amazing purpose. Sometimes he chooses people like Joseph and Daniel, right? Like pristine, upstanding individuals that, getting some tingles, that they're not as crazy, dysfunctional as other characters. But sometimes God uses people like Paul who persecute his followers and he repurposes them. So God is not afraid of our dysfunction. David was a man of violence, right? Very violent. A man of dysfunction. If we think about his response later on with the wife of Uriah, there's a whole bunch of things there that David is not an upstanding individual if you look at his whole life. But yet, God still favors him, right? So the covenant God creates with people is not based off of their behavior. It's based off of his character. That's why it's righteousness by faith. Okay, it will take every triggered nerve, every tremble in your voice, every butterfly in your belly, and every rejoicing ancestor for you to say, no, I'm not doing this anymore. What is the this? You got to figure it out. Whatever your this is, it could be different from everyone else. Got to figure out what this is and lean against that pattern that's been passed down from generation to generation. Okay, let's pray, and we'll be done. And I'll stick around for more questions, but I want to be respectful of your time. All right, let's pray. Father God, you know that we come from imperfect families, and you know that we have behavior patterns that aren't always helpful to us or other people. In fact, we do a lot of things that hurt people that we love. And we know that we are not too far distant from Abraham's family. God, you are so different from us. You are so foreign to us because you are a God of love and patience and loyalty, and you want to make your covenant with us in spite of all this stuff that we do. Pray you come into our hearts tonight, Lord. Give us your peace. Share with us your wisdom. Help us to know what patterns we have in our lives maybe we should focus on first. Give us insight into those patterns. Help us identify those behaviors as symptoms of the systems, and then give us strength to lean against all of that stuff and do things in a different way. Amen.
Thank you all for coming this evening. Tomorrow morning at 9:30, we will continue with part 2, triangles part 1, trapping ourselves in troublesome triangles. Learn the roles we play in relational triangles. Is there a better way? So have a wonderful night, drive safe, and God bless.